Picture this. The moon hangs low over the desert, casting silver across endless sand. The air is still, impossibly quiet, as if the earth itself is holding its breath. Shadows stretch long from formations that have stood here longer than memory, longer perhaps than we dare to imagine. In this silence, time feels different. Not the rushing, relentless march we know from our daily lives, but something slower, deeper, something patient. The stones beneath this moonlight have witnessed the rise and fall of empires we can barely name. They've felt the footsteps of travelers whose languages are now extinct, whose gods are forgotten, whose very existence leaves only the faintest whisper in the archaeological record. This is where our journey begins, not in the bright certainty of museum displays or textbook timelines, but here, in the liminal space between knowing and wondering. Because the truth about our past is written not just in what survives, but in what has vanished. In the gaps between stories, in the questions that archaeology cannot yet answer. What truly survives the passage of time? Not the soft things, not cloth or wood or flesh, not voices or songs, or the countless ordinary moments that made up ancient lives. What remains are bones and stones, fragments and foundations. From these pieces, we attempt to reconstruct entire civilizations, to hear echoes of voices that fell silent millennia ago. But what if the story is older than we think? What if beneath the foundations we've found, there are older foundations still? What if the monuments we attribute to known dynasties were already ancient when those pharaohs first gazed upon them? Tonight, we'll walk through landscapes that remember things we've forgotten. We'll stand before stones that may have been carved when the Sahara was green, when rivers flowed where now there is only sand, when the stars themselves occupied different positions in the night sky. The desert keeps its secrets well. But sometimes, when the light falls just right, when researchers ask the right questions, when erosion reveals what was hidden, when new technologies pierce through layers of assumption, sometimes the ancient world speaks back. The work of reconstructing the past is detective work on an impossible scale. Imagine trying to understand an entire civilization from a handful of broken pottery shards, a scatter of stone tools, and fragments of bone weathered by 10,000 seasons. This is the challenge archaeologists face. They excavate carefully, brushing away sand grain by grain, photographing every layer, cataloging every fragment. A piece of charcoal becomes a date. A pollen grain reveals what plants once grew here. The chemical signature in ancient teeth tells stories of diet and migration. From these minute pieces, entire narratives emerge. We learn that humans walked upright across East African plains millions of years ago. We trace their gradual spread across continents, following stone tools and campfire remnants like breadcrumbs through deep time. We watch through the evidence they left behind as our ancestors learned to control fire, to craft increasingly sophisticated implements, to bury their dead with ritual care that suggests the birth of symbolic thought. The science is rigorous, the methodologies tested and refined over decades of scholarship. Carbon dating, stratigraphy, DNA analysis, satellite imagery. Modern archaeology employs an impressive arsenal of techniques to pull truth from soil. Yet for all this precision, for all these technological marvels, archaeology confronts a fundamental problem. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The archaeological record is not a complete chronicle, but a fragmentary survival, a story with most of its pages missing, its chapters out of order, whole volumes lost entirely to decay and disaster. Consider what survives and what doesn't. Stone endures. Certain ceramics persist. Gold, being inert, lasts. But organic materials, papyrus, leather, wood, textile, these decay rapidly in most environments. Entire traditions might have existed, sophisticated and complex, but left no trace we can currently recognize. This is where certainty gives way to uncertainty, where the clean narratives of textbooks reveal their gaps and assumptions, where alternative theories find the oxygen to breathe. The historical record, as we understand it, possesses enormous voids. Not small gaps or minor uncertainties, but vast stretches of time about which we know almost nothing. Take North Africa during the Pleistocene. We have evidence of human presence, scattered tools, occasional bones. But of their cultures, their beliefs, their social structures, silence. Thousands of years pass in the record as little more than typological categories. Upper Paleolithic, Epipaleolithic, labels that contain multitudes we cannot access. Then there are the landscapes that changed so dramatically that entire chapters of human history now lie beneath desert sands or beneath the sea. When sea levels were lower during the Ice Age, humans inhabited coastlines that are now drowned. When the Sahara was green, communities thrived where now no life can persist. Those worlds are largely lost to us. This is where controversy enters. In the absence of clear evidence, different interpretations multiply. Mainstream archaeology, cautious and evidence-based, draws conclusions only from what can be demonstrated. It dates Egyptian civilization to around 5,000 years ago, because that's when the clear, unambiguous evidence appears: writing, monumental architecture, organized states. But other voices suggest a different possibility. What if the sophisticated building techniques, the astronomical knowledge, the engineering precision evident in ancient monuments, what if these weren't invented rapidly by the early dynasties, but inherited from predecessor cultures? Cultures that thrived during the African humid period, when the climate was utterly different? These alternative theories exist in the space between what we can prove and what we can imagine. They point to anomaly structures that seem too advanced for their attributed time periods, erosion patterns that suggest greater age, astronomical alignments that imply sophisticated skywatching over many generations. The debate is not between knowledge and ignorance, but between different types of knowing. Between the conservative interpretation that trusts only what can be firmly dated and the speculative reconstruction that sees hints of older chapters in the features the orthodox timeline cannot fully explain. Meanwhile, the stones remain silent, keeping whatever secrets they hold. Here's something strange. In 1997, archaeologists working deep in the Egyptian desert, far from any coast, uncovered the remains of a Roman ship, not fragments, not just anchors or cargo, an actual vessel buried in sand, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest water. How does a ship end up in the middle of a desert? The answer reshapes our understanding of landscapes. 2,000 years ago, when that ship sailed, the terrain was different. Ancient maps reference lakes and waterways, where now there is only arid emptiness. Climate records confirm that the region experienced different rainfall patterns, different water tables. The ship, once sailing on water, was gradually left behind as the landscape dried, as lakes evaporated, as river channels shifted and vanished. The desert crept over it, grain by grain, until it became a mystery for modern excavators to ponder. This single artifact illustrates a crucial truth. Landscapes are not static. The Egypt we see today, scorching sand and narrow Nile, is a recent configuration in geological terms. 10,000 years ago, it was profoundly different. 100,000 years ago, different still. If landscapes can transform so completely in mere millennia, what might lie buried beneath our assumptions? What cities, what civilizations, what human stories are hidden under dunes that were once riverbanks, or beneath waters that were once valleys? The Roman ship in the desert becomes a metaphor, a reminder that the ground beneath our feet remembers transformations we can barely imagine. That the stage on which human history played out was constantly shifting, constantly reshaping the possibilities of where people could live and what they could build. Rewind the clock 10,000 years. The climate of North Africa undergoes a dramatic transformation. The last ice age is ending. Glaciers retreat across the northern latitudes. Monsoon patterns shift, and suddenly the Sahara blooms. This period, called the African Humid Period by climatologists, lasted from roughly 11,000 to 5,000 years ago. During these millennia, the region we now know as the world's largest hot desert was a mosaic of grasslands, woodlands, wetlands. Rivers flowed from highlands, creating vast watersheds. Lakes dotted the landscape, some large enough to be called inland seas. Archaeological evidence confirms human populations flourished here. Rock art across the Sahara depicts hippos, crocodiles, elephants, giraffe species that require substantial water and vegetation. The art shows boats, suggesting not just rivers, but navigation, trade, movement across waterways. Settlements appeared near these ancient lakes. People fished, hunted, herded cattle. They crafted pottery and developed complex social structures. The evidence suggests not scattered nomadic bands, but organized communities with territories and traditions. This was the Egypt that existed before Egypt, as we know it, before pyramids, before pharaohs, before hieroglyphs. A green land, rich and inhabited, where cultures developed in relative prosperity. Then, gradually, the climate shifted again. The monsoons weakened. Rainfall decreased. Rivers began to fail. Lakes shrank. The grasslands withered, and the desert advanced. This transformation wasn't instantaneous. It unfolded over centuries. But its effects were inexorable. The populations that had thrived in the Green Sahara faced a choice: adapt, migrate, or perish. Many moved toward the Nile Valley, one of the few water sources that remained reliable as the desert encroached. They brought with them their skills, their traditions, their accumulated knowledge of astronomy and agriculture and animal husbandry. Could these migrants have been the foundation on which Egyptian civilization arose? Not inventing everything from scratch, but carrying forward expertise developed over millennia and now vanished landscapes? The orthodox timeline rarely emphasizes this continuity. It presents Egyptian civilization as emerging rather suddenly around 3100 BCE with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. But the deeper question lingers. What came before? What was inherited rather than invented? According to the standard historical narrative, human civilization, in the sense of cities, writing, monumental architecture, begins around 5,000 years ago. Mesopotamia's city-states, Egypt's early dynasties, the Indus Valley settlements, these appear in the archaeological record as humanity's first experiments with complex society. Before this, the story goes, there were only simpler cultures: hunter-gatherers, early farmers, small villages. People certainly capable and intelligent, but not yet organized on the scale required for massive construction projects or sophisticated astronomical observations. This narrative has substantial evidence supporting it. The invention of writing, the development of bronze metallurgy, the appearance of specialized labor and administrative hierarchies, all these features emerge clearly in the archaeological record around the same period across different regions. Yet alternative researchers point to anomalies that don't quite fit this tidy progression. They note that some structures appear to demonstrate engineering knowledge that should have required generations to develop, appearing seemingly without precursors. They observe astronomical alignments in monuments that suggest long-term observation of celestial cycles, the kind of knowledge that accumulates slowly over centuries. Most intriguingly, they reference sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey. Here, massive stone pillars, carved with intricate reliefs, date to over 11,000 years ago, predating the supposed beginning of civilization by 6 millennia. The structures required sophisticated planning, coordination of labor, symbolic complexity. Yet they exist in a period mainstream archaeology categorized as pre-civilized. Göbekli Tepe has forced a reconsideration of timelines. If people in the 10th millennium BCE could quarry, carve, and erect monumental architecture, what else might they have accomplished? What other sites might exist, unrecognized or still buried? The alternative hypothesis suggests precursor cultures people who developed significant organizational and technical skills but left little trace because they built primarily in perishable materials, or because their sites are now underwater or under desert sands, or simply because we haven't yet found them. This isn't fringe speculation disconnected from evidence. It's an extrapolation based on genuine gaps in the record, genuine anomalies that standard models struggle to accommodate. The question isn't whether these precursor cultures definitely existed, but whether the absence of evidence, given how much has been lost to time, should be interpreted as evidence of absence. The Great Pyramid of Giza is commonly attributed to Khufu, 4th dynasty pharaoh, around 2560 BCE. The Sphinx is generally dated to the same period. Egyptian civilization, in the orthodox view, builds these monuments relatively early in its development, then spends subsequent centuries' refinement, and decline no later structures match the precision of the Giza Plateau. But what if these monuments weren't built during the 4th dynasty? What if the early pharaohs inherited structures already ancient, incorporating them into their own cultural narratives? The idea sounds radical, yet it emerges from a set of observations that don't comfortably fit the standard chronology. Consider the megalithic tradition. Across the Mediterranean and beyond, cultures built with massive stones, often shaped and fitted with extraordinary precision. These megalithic structures appear in various locations and time periods, suggesting a widespread technological approach to monumental construction. Some of these megalithic sites are extremely old. Göbekli Tepe, as mentioned, dates to 9600 BCE. Stonehenge's earliest phases date to around 3000 BCE. The megalithic temples of Malta are similarly ancient. If megalithic construction was happening elsewhere in the pre-dynastic world, is it impossible that similar traditions existed in North Africa during the Green Sahara period? That communities along ancient river systems developed their own monumental architecture, perhaps aligned with astronomical phenomena important to their cosmology. When the climate shifted and these communities were forced to migrate, might they have brought these building traditions to the Nile Valley? Might some structures at Giza or elsewhere be remnants of these older traditions, later repurposed or renovated by the pharaohs we know from written history? There's no definitive proof of this sequence, but there are suggestive details. The core masonry of certain structures differs from the outer casing stones, hinting at different construction phases. Some temples appear to have been built atop older foundations. Certain features show signs of weathering that seems inconsistent with the relatively sheltered environment of the past 5,000 years. These observations don't prove an earlier origin, but they keep the question alive. Might the roots of Egyptian monumentality reach deeper than the textbooks acknowledge? Few monuments have inspired as much debate as the Great Sphinx of Giza. This colossal figure, a lion's body with a human head, has gazed across the desert for millennia. But exactly how many millennia remains contested. The orthodox date places the Sphinx's carving during the reign of Kefir, around 2500 BCE. This date derives from stylistic analysis of the head, its proximity to Kafur's pyramid, and certain inscriptions. By this reckoning, the Sphinx is roughly 4,500 years old. In the early 1990s, geologist Robert Schoch examined the Sphinx from a different angle literally. Rather than focusing on stylistic or textual evidence, he studied the weathering patterns on the Sphinx's limestone body. What he observed surprised him. The erosion appeared to show characteristics of water weathering, not wind-blown sand abrasion, but the kind of furrowing and undercutting produced by sustained rainfall. Here's the problem. Egypt's climate has been arid for thousands of years. Rainfall in the Giza region is minimal and has been for the entire span of pharaonic civilization. For water weathering to create such pronounced erosion, the Sphinx would need to have been carved when Egypt received significantly more rain. When was that? During the African humid period, which ended around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in northern Egypt. This would push the Sphinx's age back to at least 7,000 BCE, possibly earlier. The geological claim immediately sparked controversy. Egyptologists pointed out that no other evidence of such ancient civilization exists in Egypt. No tools, no settlements, no other monuments from that period. How could people carve a monumental statue without leaving other traces? Geologists countered that their observations were based on physical weathering analysis, not archaeological assumption. The stone shows what it shows. A middle position emerged. Perhaps the erosion isn't from rainfall directly on the Sphinx, but from groundwater seeping through the limestone during periods of higher Nile flooding, or from intermittent storms that don't require a full climate shift. The debate remains unresolved, but it illustrates a crucial dynamic. Different disciplines, using different methodologies, can arrive at contradictory conclusions from the same monument. The weathering patterns are real. The archaeological context is real. Reconciling them remains challenging. Meanwhile, the Sphinx continues its vigil, its features worn smooth by time, whether that time is measured in thousands of years or tens of thousands. In 1975, a freak storm struck the Algerian Sahara. For hours, rain fell on land that hadn't seen meaningful precipitation in decades. The parched soil couldn't absorb the deluge. Water began to flow, cutting temporary channels through sand and rock. For a few days, the desert had rivers. Researchers documented the phenomenon, watching as ancient wadis' dry riverbeds that hadn't flowed in millennia briefly carried water again. The rushing torrents revealed stratification in the sediment, exposed fossils, carved new features into old formations. Then, the rain stopped. The water evaporated or sank into the sand. The rivers vanished as quickly as they'd appeared. The desert returned to silence. This event, traumatic but temporary, offers a glimpse into the dynamism of climate. What we perceive as permanent, the dry Sahara, the narrow fertile strip of the Nile, is merely a snapshot in a much longer story of oscillation. Climate records reconstructed from ice cores, lake sediments, and ocean floor samples reveal constant fluctuation. Periods of cold and warmth, wet and dry, follow one another in cycles both rapid and gradual. Some shifts unfold over tens of thousands of years. Others happen within decades. The 1975 Algerian storm is a small echo of much larger transformations. 10,000 years ago, those temporary wadis were permanent rivers. Lakes dotted the landscape. The seasonal rains that now barely reach the Sahara's northern fringes penetrated deep into the interior. Civilizations rose in those wetter times. And when the rains failed, those civilizations faced impossible choices. How many times has this cycle repeated? How many cultures flourished in landscapes that are now inhospitable, leaving traces we can barely recognize or haven't yet discovered? The plateau remembers, encoded in its stones and sediments, even when human memory fails. Approximately 12,800 years ago, the Earth was warming steadily. The last ice age was in retreat, glaciers melting, sea levels rising. Then, suddenly, the warming stopped. Temperatures plummeted, glaciers re-advanced. The climate swung back toward ice age conditions in a geological eye blink. This period, called the Younger Dryas, lasted roughly 1,200 years before warming resumed again around 11,600 years ago. What caused this dramatic reversal? The leading theory involves meltwater from retreating ice sheets disrupting ocean currents. Massive freshwater pulses entering the North Atlantic may have shut down or weakened the thermaline circulation, the ocean as heat distribution system. Without this warm current, northern climates plunged. The effects were global. Rainfall patterns shifted. Some regions that had been dry received moisture. Others that depended on monsoons saw them fail. Ecosystems transformed rapidly. Species went extinct. Human communities adapted or dispersed. This wasn't the only such event. The climate of the Pleistocene and early Holocene was characterized by instability, rapid oscillations, sudden shifts, dramatic regional variations. The relatively stable climate of the past few thousand years is actually anomalous in the longer view. Now imagine human societies navigating these changes. A community established near a reliable river might find it drying up within a generation. Hunting grounds could turn to desert or forest to tundra. Coastal settlements might be inundated by rising seas. Such catastrophic shifts would erase civilizations. People would scatter, carrying fragments of their culture to new regions. Knowledge would be lost, traditions forgotten. Within a few generations, the old world would become myth stories of a time when the gods were closer, when cities existed in lands now swallowed by the sea or desert. Global flood myths take on new resonance in this context. Nearly every ancient culture has stories of a great deluge that destroyed the world before. For generations, these were dismissed as pure mythology. But we now know that sea levels rose dramatically over 120 meters, between 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, as the ice sheets melted. Coastlines didn't just shift gradually. Meltwater pulses caused rapid inundations. Communities living on river deltas or coastal plains could have experienced catastrophic floods, their settlements submerged, their survivors fleeing inland with stories of the waters that swallowed the world. These aren't myths in the sense of fabrications. They're cultural memories of real events, transmitted orally across generations until they became part of sacred tradition. The climate of the late Ice Age and early Holocene created forgotten worlds, landscapes, and ways of life that vanished so completely we can barely reconstruct them. The Epic of Gilgamesh, among the oldest written stories, includes a flood narrative. A man named Utnapishtim builds a boat to survive divine deluge. The story predates the biblical Noah by over 1,000 years and shares remarkable parallels: the boat, the animals, the landing on a mountain, the sending of birds. In Hindu tradition, Manu survives a world-destroying flood with help from a giant fish. In Greek mythology, Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survive when Zeus floods the earth. Chinese legends tell of Gunyu taming the great floods. Mesoamerican myths describe watery destruction preceding the current world age. These aren't identical stories. The details vary significantly. But the core motif, catastrophic flood, small group of survivors, world reborn, appears across cultures separated by vast distances and millennia. For a long time, scholars treated these as independent mythological inventions, archetypal stories humans naturally create about destruction and renewal. But the geological record suggests another possibility: cultural memory. When the Ice Age ended, the sea level rise wasn't gradual and gentle. It happened in pulses. Ice sheets would collapse, releasing enormous volumes of meltwater over short periods. Coastlines would advance kilometers inland within years or even months. Any communities living in those coastal zones would have experienced genuine catastrophe. Their fields submerged, their settlements swallowed. They would flee to higher ground, carrying memories of unimaginable waters rising. These memories would be retold, taking on mythic dimensions: divine punishment, cosmic renewal, moral lessons. But beneath the theological overlay might lie genuine historical experience of climate-driven disaster. Consider Sundaland, the exposed landmass that connected Southeast Asian islands during the Ice Age. At the last glacial maximum, Indonesia, Malaysia, and parts of the Philippines formed a continuous landscape. This area was larger than India. As seas rose, Sundaland drowned. If human populations existed there, and archaeological evidence suggests they did, those populations were displaced. Their settlements, their monuments, their cultural centers now lie beneath 50 to 100 meters of water. Similar inundations occurred globally. The Black Sea may have been a freshwater lake that was suddenly breached by Mediterranean waters rushing through the Bosporus, a catastrophic flood that some researchers link to ancient Near Eastern flood myths. The Persian Gulf was dry land during the Ice Age, a river valley where human habitation was likely. As seas rose, it flooded, becoming the Gulf we know today. How many early civilizations developed in these now drowned landscapes? How much of the human story is written on stone tablets, lying in silt beneath the waves? We're only beginning to explore these questions. Marine archaeology is expensive and technically challenging, but each survey of ancient coastlines reveals more: submerged forests, drowned river valleys, and increasingly, signs of human presence. The flood myths may not be myths at all. They may be the last echoes of drowned lands, and that the rock art of the Sahara preserves memories of impossible worlds. On stone faces across the desert, ancient artists painted scenes of fertility: elephants and giraffes, crocodiles and hippopotami, herds of cattle tended by human figures, boats sailing on rivers that exist only as memory. These images date from the African humid period, when the Sahara was a dramatically different place. Archaeological surveys have identified thousands of these rock art sites, clustered around now dry lake basins and ancient watercourses. The level of artistic skill varies, but at their best, these works are sophisticated dynamic compositions, showing hunting scenes, dancing figures, complex geometric patterns. They suggest not just isolated artists, but artistic traditions passed down through generations. But the implications go beyond art. The boats are particularly intriguing. They're not simple rafts, but substantial vessels, some appearing to have multiple rowers or sails. They suggest not just crossing rivers, but navigation, transport, trade networks across waterways. Where there's trade, there's usually specialization. Some communities focusing on fishing, others on herding or agriculture, exchanging goods and ideas. This is the foundation of complex society. Archaeological excavations in the Sahara have uncovered settlement sites with permanent structures, storage facilities, cemeteries that suggest stable communities. Pottery fragments show regional styles that evolve over time, exactly what you'd expect from culturally distinct groups in ongoing contact. One of the most remarkable sites is Nabta Playa in southern Egypt. Here, researchers found stone circles and alignments dating to around 5000 BC, possibly earlier. The arrangement of stones appears to show astronomical knowledge, marking cardinal directions and potentially solstice positions. If Nabta Playa shows astronomical sophistication in the 6th millennium BCE, what might earlier or more elaborate sites have looked like? Sites that might now be buried under dunes or eroded beyond recognition? The Green Sahara civilizations, if we can call them, that left no writing we can read. They built no monumental stone architecture that survived, but they existed, developed complex cultures, and accumulated knowledge over millennia. When the rains failed and the desert advanced, these populations faced environmental collapse. The archaeological evidence shows abandonment of Saharan sites over a span of centuries, with people migrating toward remaining water sources. Many moved east toward the Nile. They didn't arrive empty-handed. They brought cattle, pottery traditions, artistic styles, astronomical knowledge, accumulated expertise from thousands of years of Saharan cultural development. This migration is rarely emphasized in popular accounts of Egyptian origins, but it may be crucial to understanding how Egyptian civilization achieved sophistication so apparently rapidly. The early dynasties weren't starting from scratch. They were synthesizing and organizing traditions carried from the drying Sahara. People who once called them home. Picture the scene: families packing what they can carry, driving herds before them, traveling east in search of water that no longer comes with the seasons. Behind them, lakes they've known their entire lives shrink to muddy pools. Wells fail. Grass withers. This exodus wasn't a single event, but a process unfolding over centuries. As the climate dried, Saharan communities shifted from areas that became uninhabitable, first to marginal zones, then increasingly toward the Nile Valley, one of the few water sources that remained reliable regardless of failing rains. The Nile's annual flood, fed by monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands, continued even as local rainfall in Egypt diminished. The valley became a refuge, a narrow strip of fertility in expanding desolation. But this migration wasn't a simple story of desperate refugees. These were people with skills, traditions, and sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, animal husbandry, agriculture, and resource management. They'd thrived in the Green Sahara for millennia, developing cultural complexity that left traces in rock art and settlement patterns. When they reached the Nile, they encountered peoples already there, fishing communities, early farmers, groups that had inhabited the valley continuously. The meeting of these populations, Saharan migrants and valley dwellers, created a cultural crucible. Technologies mixed, traditions blended, social organizations evolved. The pottery styles of the late pre-dynastic period show influences from multiple sources. Burial practices reveal syncretism of different ritual traditions. Some researchers suggest this population convergence explains the seemingly rapid emergence of Egyptian civilization. Rather than a single group suddenly inventing complex society, it was multiple sophisticated cultures merging, pooling their collective knowledge into something greater than any single tradition. This would explain certain anomalies. For instance, the astronomical alignments in early Egyptian structures suggest generations of sky-watching experience, exactly what you'd expect if migrant populations brought accumulated astronomical knowledge from Saharan sites like Nabda Playa. It would also explain the technical sophistication of early dynastic building. If Saharan populations had megalithic traditions, developed in now-lost monuments, the expertise of stoneworking might have been imported rather than invented anew. The orthodox timeline presents Egyptian civilization as emerging around 3100 BCE with the unification under Narmer. But increasingly, scholars recognize this unification as the culmination of long, pre-dynastic development, centuries of cultural evolution now compressed in our narratives because the evidence is sparse. If we extend that development further back, incorporating the Green Sahara migrations and the knowledge they carried, a different picture emerges. Not civilization born suddenly, but civilization crystallizing from older streams, like the Nile itself fed by countless tributaries. Look up at the night sky. The North Star sits nearly aligned with Earth's rotational axis, marking celestial north with convenient precision. Sailors navigate by it. Desert travelers orient themselves by it. It seems eternal, fixed. But it's not. Over time, over centuries and millennia, the North Star drifts. This phenomenon is called precession. Earth's axis wobbles like a spinning top, completing one full cycle approximately every 26,000 years. As the axis wobbles, the point in the sky it seems to point toward changes. The star we call the North Star is only the North Star for our particular era. 5,000 years ago, when the pyramids were being built, a different star, Thuban, in the constellation Draco, sat closer to the celestial pole. 13,000 years from now, Vega will be the pole star. The ancient Egyptians knew about precession, or at least, they observed its effects. Their priests were meticulous astronomers, tracking star positions across generations. They noted which stars rose heliacally with the sun at different times of year, using these observations to calibrate their calendar and predict the Nile's flood. But how far back does this astronomical knowledge extend? How many generations of observation would be required to notice precession's slow drift? This is where the chronology debate intensifies. Some alternative researchers argue that certain alignments in Egyptian monuments encode precessional knowledge that would require observation, spanning thousands of years longer than the conventional timeline allows. For example, the Giza Pyramid's alignment to cardinal directions shows remarkable precision. But more intriguingly, Some scholars suggest the three pyramids mirror the pattern of Orion as belt, a constellation deeply significant in Egyptian mythology as associated with Osiris. The orientation of this stellar pattern changes over precessional cycles. If the pyramids are indeed intentionally aligned with Orion, they might encode a specific epoch, a particular moment in the 26,000-year cycle. Calculating backwards from the alignment, some researchers propose dates far earlier than the conventional 2500 BCE. This remains highly controversial. Mainstream Egyptologists argue the evidence for intentional astronomical alignment is overstated, that the precision is either coincidental or simply reflects the builder's engineering skill without deeper cosmic meaning. But the fascination with ancient astronomical knowledge persists because the ancients were sophisticated skywatchers. They didn't have our telescopes or mathematical models, but they had something perhaps more valuable: time and attention. Generations of priests could observe, record, and transmit knowledge across centuries. If we accept that Egyptian civilization inherited traditions from earlier Saharan cultures, and those cultures had their own astronomical practices stretching back millennia, the accumulated knowledge could indeed be very deep. The stars have always moved. The question is, how long have humans been watching them move? The Great Pyramid stands not just as a monument to engineering, but to precision. Its sides align to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, with accuracy that modern surveys confirm to within a fraction of a degree. This precision isn't accidental. The builders clearly possessed sophisticated surveying techniques. They may have used stellar observations, tracking the rising and setting points of circumpolar stars to establish true north. Or they might have used solar methods, measuring shadow angles at carefully timed intervals. What makes this remarkable is the consistency. Multiple structures across Egypt show similar cardinal alignments. A precision ISN, a one-time achievement, but a sustained tradition of astronomical observation applied to monumental construction. Then there's the Orion correlation theory, proposed by Robert Bovau. He noted that the three main pyramids at Giza Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure don't sit in a perfect straight line. The third is offset slightly to the east. Looking at Orion's belt, the three stars similarly show a slight offset in the third star. Bovau suggested the pyramid layout deliberately mirrors this stellar pattern. The theory extends further. The Nile's position relative to the pyramids might mirror the Milky Way's position relative to Orion in the sky. Other pyramid sites along the Nile could correspond to other stars in the Orion constellation or nearby constellations. If true, this would mean ancient Egyptian architects were engaged in a form of astrotheology, building an earthly reflection of cosmic patterns, grounding their monuments in celestial symbolism. The mainstream response has been mixed. The correlation is intriguing, but not exact. The alignments are approximate rather than perfect. It's possible the arrangement is coincidental or reflects practical considerations, topography, bedrock quality, logistics rather than cosmic mapping. Moreover, even if the correlation is intentional, it doesn't necessarily require a timeline older than the conventional dates. Fourth Dynasty astronomers could have observed Orion and incorporated its pattern into their monumental design. Yet questions linger. Why would a civilization just emerging from prehistory immediately start building monuments aligned with such precision to celestial phenomena? This suggests not early experimentation, but mature practice, the culmination of long tradition rather than its beginning. Similar alignments appear at other ancient sites worldwide. Stonehenge marks solstice sunrise. Angkor Wat incorporates complex astronomical symbolism. Mesoamerican pyramids align with equinoxes. Is this evidence of a global ancient tradition of astronomical architecture? Or is it simply that most cultures, being agricultural and thus dependent on seasonal cycles, developed astronomy independently and applied it to their most important structures? Both explanations have merit, but the precision at Giza The sophistication of the knowledge required keeps the alternative theories alive. In the granite quarries of Aswan, unfinished monuments lie abandoned. Most famous is the unfinished obelisk, a colossal stone that would have stood 42 meters tall if completed. Cracks appeared during extraction, and the project was abandoned, leaving the massive stone still partially attached to bedrock. For researchers, this abandoned work is a gift, a chance to study ancient stoneworking techniques directly, without the polished finish that conceals methodology. What they've found is puzzling. The stone shows marks from pounding tools, hard dolerite hammers, striking granite to slowly chip away unwanted material. This matches the conventional understanding of Egyptian stoneworking: patient, labor-intensive percussion. But there are other marks: scoop-shaped depressions, channels with curved bottoms, holes that appear drilled rather than pecked. These features are harder to explain with copper tools and stone hammers alone. Copper, being softer than granite, shouldn't be able to cut it effectively. Yet copper saws and drills are what the conventional toolkit allows for the period. The explanation usually involves abrasive sand copper tools serving as holders for quartz sand, with the hard sand grains doing the actual cutting. This works for some features. But experimental archaeology, modern craftspeople attempting to replicate ancient techniques, finds certain marks, surprisingly difficult to reproduce this way. The core samples from drilled holes, for instance, show regular spiral grooves suggesting rapid, consistent drilling. Replicating this with copper and sand requires extraordinary skill and time. Some researchers have suggested unknown advanced techniques. Could the Egyptians have had abrasives or tools that didn't survive the archaeological record? Could they have known methods of making copper harder through techniques lost to us? Or more speculatively, could some of the stone working predate the dynastic period? Might early pharaohs have inscribed and completed monuments that were roughed out or even partially completed by earlier cultures? This last idea remains fringe, but it's prompted by the difficulty of explaining certain features with the known toolkit, and by evidence that some structures show multiple phases of work in different styles. The hands in the stone left their marks. We can trace their paths, measure their cuts, but their techniques, their tools, sometimes elude our full understanding. The limestone blocks of the Great Pyramid are not uniform blank stone. Look closely not at the surfaces smoothed by human hands, but at broken faces where the raw stone shows, and you'll find fossils. These aren't deliberate placements. They're natural inclusions. Shells, marine microorganisms, skeletal fragments of ancient sea creatures. They're pressed into the stone itself, frozen in mineral for millions of years. The presence of marine fossils in Egyptian limestone tells a story far older than humanity. 50 million years ago, the region where the pyramids now stand was covered by warm, shallow seas. Marine life flourished: nummulites, coin-shaped foraminifera, shells, corals. When these creatures died, they settled on the seafloor. Over time, sediment accumulated above them. Pressure and chemical processes turned the sediment into limestone, preserving the organic remains as fossils. Eventually, tectonic forces lifted these ancient seabeds above water. Erosion exposed the limestone formations. And when humans arrived, they quarried this stone, building their monuments from what had once been the ocean floor. So the stones of Giza remember oceans. They remember depths and tides and creatures that swam when Africa was a different shape, when mammals were small and primitive, when the story of humanity hadn't yet begun. This is the deep time encoded in the monuments, not just the 5,000 years since their construction, but the 50 million years since the stone itself formed. It's a useful perspective. We focus on the human story, on pharaohs and dynasties, on cultural meaning and architectural achievement. But the stones themselves are chapters from Earth's much longer narrative. They remind us that human history, even extended back to the earliest migrations out of Africa, is a recent footnote in the planet's 4 billion-year story. The landscapes we think of as eternal deserts, mountains, coastlines are temporary configurations, constantly reshaped by forces operating on scales we struggle to comprehend. The sea inside the stone whispers this truth. Nothing is permanent. Everything transforms. Even the seemingly eternal pyramids are merely borrowing atoms that have been other things' ocean creatures. Sediment, seafloor, and will become other things still when the pyramids themselves erode to sand. Off the coast of Alexandria, divers descend through blue water to a drowned world. Below them, the ruins of ancient structures emerge from the seafloor, fallen columns, toppled statues, street grids swallowed by the waves. This is Heracleion, once a major Egyptian port city. For centuries, it existed only in ancient texts mentions by Herodotus and others, describing a grand harbor at the Nile's canopic mouth. Then, in the early 2000s, underwater surveys rediscovered it, lying 5 meters beneath the surface. The city didn't sink dramatically in a single catastrophe. Rather, the Nile Delta subsided gradually, the ground compacting under its own weight and periodic earthquakes accelerating the descent. Over centuries, buildings that once stood on solid ground found themselves awash, then submerged, finally lost entirely beneath the waves and silt. Heracleion is not alone. Alexandria itself, the famous city founded by Alexander the Great, has large submerged sections. The ancient harbor, the royal quarters, parts of the palace complex where Cleopatra once walked, all now underwater, accessible only to divers and underwater robots. Further along the coast, surveys have identified other submerged settlements. The Mediterranean has risen relative to the Egyptian shoreline due to a combination of sea level rise and land subsidence. Coastlines that were stable for millennia slowly transformed, claiming human structures built with no expectation of inundation. This has profound implications for understanding Egyptian prehistory. If historical cities from the Greek and Roman periods are now underwater, what about older settlements from the pre-dynastic period or earlier? The Nile Delta has been growing and subsiding for millennia. River sediment extends the coastline, but the weight of that sediment causes the delta to sink. Sea levels have fluctuated. The configuration of the coast during the Green Sahara period or during the early Holocene was different from today. Any settlements built on delta lands or near the coast during those earlier periods might now be deeply buried under silt or submerged beneath the Mediterranean. This is why the archaeological record may be incomplete. We excavate sites that survived inland locations on stable ground. But we miss entirely the coastal communities, the harbor towns, the river settlements that are now inaccessible beneath water and sediment. If Egypt as cultural development began not in the narrow Nile Valley, but in now-drowned delta environments during winter periods, we'd have no access to that evidence without extensive underwater archaeology. Each submerged statue recovered, each underwater survey revealing street plans, reminds us that history's visible chapters may not be the whole story. The sea holds secrets, concealing entire eras of human experience beneath its dark blue silence. Writing is a recent invention. The earliest clear writing systems, Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs date to around 3200 BCE. Before that, we have proto-writing pictographic symbols that convey limited information. And before that, silence. This silence is deceptive. It suggests that nothing complex was happening before writing appeared, that human societies lacked organization, lacked accumulated knowledge, lacked the ability to plan and execute sophisticated projects. But writing is not synonymous with civilization or intelligence. It's a specific technology for information storage and transmission. Highly complex cultures can exist entirely in oral tradition. Consider the Aboriginal Australians, whose cultures have persisted for over 50,000 years through oral transmission. Their knowledge systems, navigation, ecology, law, cosmology are sophisticated and vast, encoded in song, story, and ceremony rather than text. Or the Inca, who built a massive empire spanning thousands of kilometers, administering it not with writing, but with quipus knotted cords that encoded numerical and possibly linguistic information we're still learning to decode. Writing emerges when societies face problems that oral tradition can't efficiently solve. Long-distance administration, trade accounting, codifying complex laws. It's a tool for specific contexts, not a prerequisite for sophistication. So the absence of writing in Egypt before 3100 BCE doesn't mean absence of culture. It means whatever cultures existed didn't require or develop that particular technology. This is crucial for evaluating alternative timelines. The argument, we have no written records from before 3200 BCE, therefore no complex culture existed, is fallacious. Plenty of complex cultures exist without writing. Could pre-dynastic Egypt, or the Green Sahara cultures before them, have possessed significant astronomical knowledge, architectural skills, social organization, artistic traditions all transmitted orally and through apprenticeship? Absolutely. Not only possible, but likely. The great silence before writing is not evidence of absence. It's simply silence. What existed in that quiet may have been profound, may have laid the foundations for everything that followed, may have accumulated wisdom over thousands of years. But because oral cultures leave fewer archaeological traces than literate ones, because they don't build permanence into records, they become invisible to us. Their knowledge dies with their last speaker, unless it's absorbed into successor cultures. How many times has this happened? How many sophisticated traditions have simply vanished, leaving only the faintest echoes in later mythologies or unexplained technological capabilities? The silence before writing conceals more than we can know, and that uncertainty is where alternative theories find space to imagine older, lost chapters of human achievement. Throughout Egyptian history, pharaohs appropriated earlier works. Ramesses II famously inscribed his cartouche on monuments built by his predecessors, claiming their achievements. Later dynasties renovated temples, added their own additions, sometimes recarved faces to resemble themselves rather than the original patron. This practice of cultural appropriation and renovation creates interpretive challenges. When we find a monument with inscriptions from multiple periods, which date represents its original construction? Usually, archaeologists can differentiate layers of work. Original masonry can be distinguished from later additions. Style and technique evolve over time, leaving signatures specialists can read. But what if this pattern extends further back? What if the early dynasties themselves were renovating and inscribing monuments that predated them? The idea might sound far-fetched, but precedent exists. The Assyrian at Abydos, for instance, shows massive megalithic core construction that some researchers argue stylistically resembles Old Kingdom work. Yet it sits beneath a New Kingdom temple and bears Seti, the first inscriptions. The chronology is debated. Mainstream scholars date it to Seti I's reign, but the architectural style doesn't comfortably fit that period. Could this represent earlier construction, later claimed? Or is it simply a conservative architectural style deliberately chosen for a temple dedicated to Osiris, god of antiquity and resurrection? The Sphinx offers similar ambiguity. The head is proportionally small for the body, leading some to suggest it was recarved, that originally it depicted a full lion or different figure, and a later pharaoh, perhaps Khafre, recut the head to humanize it and appropriate the monument. There's no definitive proof of this, but the proportions are unusual, and the head shows different weathering than the body. If such renovations and appropriations occurred, the archaeological dating becomes complex. Inscriptions give us the name of the pharaoh who claimed the monument, not necessarily the name of who built it. In cultures without writing, earlier peoples might have constructed in stone, leaving no names, no inscriptions. When literate civilizations arrived, they found these nameless monuments and incorporated them into their own narratives. associating them with their gods, their kings, their mythologies. This would explain the curious phenomenon of monuments that seem technologically advanced for their attributed period. Not because ancient aliens or lost super-civilizations built them, but because they're survivals from earlier cultures, whose names we don't know, whose histories weren't written, who left only the stones. The myths and legends that surround these monuments, stories of gods building in a single night, of structures existing since the beginning of time, might be cultural memories of this disconnect. The early Egyptians themselves might have wondered who built the Sphinx, attributing it to primordial times because they had no records of its construction. Tonight, if you stood at Giza and watched the moon rise over the pyramids, you'd be standing in the footsteps of countless others who've done the same. Ancient Egyptians, certainly priests and workers, pharaohs and farmers, but also Greeks, Romans, Arabs, travelers from every age since. Each generation looks at these stones and sees something different. To the Old Kingdom Egyptians, they were fresh monuments to eternal kingship. To later dynasties, they were already ancient, impressive ancestors. To the Greeks, they were wonders worthy of listing among the greatest human achievements. To medieval Arabs, they were mysterious remnants of a vanished age. To modern visitors, they're puzzles, photo opportunities, symbols of human persistence. Yet the stones remain essentially unchanged. They sit in the desert, weathering slowly, outlasting empires and ideologies, dynasties and belief systems. Most of the hands that shape these stones are anonymous. We know some names: Khufu, Hemunu, the architect credited with the Great Pyramid. But the thousands of workers who hauled blocks, the masons who dressed stone, the surveyors who measured alignments, the craftspeople who carved and polished, these are nameless. Their work survives, but their identities are lost. They poured their sweat and skill into eternity, creating something that would last far beyond their comprehension, yet history doesn't record their names. This is true for almost all of human creation. The vast majority of people who've lived left no individual trace. We're anonymous members of countless generations, known only collectively as ancestors, people of the past, ancient ones. Yet their collective work shaped the world. Every technique passed down, every tradition maintained, every small improvement accumulated. These nameless contributions built civilization. The stones teach this humility. They stand as testimony not to individual genius, but to collective persistence. To communities that planned across generations, that invested enormous effort in projects they knew they wouldn't live to see completed. That kind of thinking, long-term, multi-generational, focused on legacy rather than immediate gain, seems alien to modern mindsets. We measure in quarters and election cycles. The ancients thought in dynasties and ages. Perhaps that's what we've lost more than any specific technical knowledge. Not the ability to cut stone or align structures, but the patience to think in centuries, the cultural cohesion to pursue projects that serve not ourselves, but distant descendants. The stones outlast names, outlast nations. They endure as testament to human capacity to create meaning beyond individual lifespans, to participate in something larger than any single generation's concerns. And they remain silent teachers of patience and persistence, waiting under the stars. The moon has traced its arc across the sky. The same desert that greeted us at the beginning of this journey still stretches silent and vast. But perhaps we've traveled further than geography. We've walked through time, not the neat, certain chronology of textbooks, but the messier, more mysterious time of geological shifts and cultural transformations, of forgotten peoples and submerged landscapes, of stones that might remember more than they reveal. We've considered the orthodox narrative, Egyptian civilization emerging around 5,000 years ago, building rapidly to an architectural and cultural peak, leaving monuments that define ancient achievement. This story is supported by substantial evidence, by carbon dates and pottery sequences, by inscriptions and historical records. But we've also explored the spaces between certainty. The climate transformations that created and destroyed the Green Sahara. The coastlines drowned by rising seas. The weathering patterns that whisper different ages. The astronomical alignments that suggest accumulated knowledge. The technical achievements that seem to appear fully formed without clear precursors. These aren't proofs of alternative timelines. They're reminders that our understanding is incomplete, that the archaeological record is fragmentary, that absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence. How much have we forgotten? If the climate shifted and coastlines drowned, if deserts swallowed once fertile lands, if cultures transmitted knowledge orally rather than in writing, how many chapters of human achievement have simply vanished? We don't know. We may never know completely. But the questions themselves are valuable. They keep us curious, keep us exploring, keep us humble about our certainty. They remind us that history isn't a closed book, but an ongoing investigation, constantly revised as new evidence emerges and new perspectives are considered. The stones at Giza will outlast our theories about them. They'll watch as we debate their origins, propose and discard hypotheses, argue about weathering and alignment, civilization and climate. They'll remain long after we've joined the anonymous generations who shaped them. Perhaps that's fitting. The true monument isn't to pharaohs or dynasties or any particular culture. It's to human persistence itself, to the impulse to build meaning from stone, to reach across time, to leave something that might endure. Whether the pyramids are 4,500 years old or older, whether they encode astronomical knowledge or simply reflect impressive engineering, whether they were built by early dynasties or inherited from earlier cultures, these questions matter less than what they represent. They're humanity's conversation with eternity, an attempt to create something permanent in an impermanent world, to build against time's erosion, to leave a mark that might outlast memory. And in that moonlit moment, standing before them, we become part of that same conversation. Looking back at the vast mystery of our collective past, looking forward to whatever mysteries the future holds, connected to all who've stood here before and all who'll stand hereafter. The journey doesn't end. It never really ends. There are always more stones to study, more landscapes to explore, more questions to ask. But for now, as the moon sets and the stars wheel slowly through their ancient patterns, we can rest in the mystery, comfortable with not knowing everything, grateful for the fragments we've pieced together, aware that the full story may be forever beyond our reach, yet still worth pursuing.